The letter came on a Tuesday, which Honoria Vell always thought was a particularly cruel day for bad news. She was on her knees in Mrs. Tate's kitchen on the east side of Halifax. Not the good side, not the side she had grown up on, scrubbing the flagstone floor with a brush that had lost half its bristles. Her hands were red and raw. Her dress, the plain brown one she wore for work, had been up since 5. She had been up since 5. The letter was brought in by the housekeeper's boy, a child of about 8 who didn't seem to understand what he was carrying. He held it out to her without ceremony, without even removing it from where it had been tucked under his arm with a bread roll. "For you," he said. Honoria sat back on her heels and looked at the envelope. She recognized the seal before she read the name. The wax was deep green, pressed with the outline of a rearing horse. She had grown up seeing that seal on documents her father signed, on invitations sent to their house in the spring, on the letters her mother kept in a mahogany box by her bed. Aldenmere, the seat of the Duke of Aldenmere, her grandfather's estate. She had not seen that seal in 4 years, not since the reading of the will, not since her Uncle Prentice had stood in the solicitor's office with that particular expression he always wore when he was about to say something that would ruin someone's life, and announced very quietly that the estate and all its lands would pass entirely to him. Honoria stood up. She dried her hands on her apron. She took the letter. It was not addressed to Miss Honoria Vell. It was addressed to Miss H. Vell, care of a boarding house on Barrington Lane. Her previous address forwarded twice. Whoever had sent it had been looking for her. She did not open it in the kitchen. She went to the small room she rented at the end of the corridor, the one with the window that faced a brick wall, and she sat on the edge of the bed and broke the seal. The letter was from a solicitor in Edinburgh named Mr. Caldwell Price. She had never heard of him. He wrote in the careful, slightly apologetic language of lawyers delivering information they know will not be welcome. He informed her that Aldenmere had been sold. Not inherited, sold. Her Uncle Prentice had borrowed against the estate for 10 years and the debt had finally overtaken him. The new owner had taken possession 2 months ago. He was a man named Rowan Alcott, the Duke of Westerfield. The solicitor included no further details about the Duke except that he was young, that he was unmarried, and that he had purchased Aldenmere outright. The letter ended with a single paragraph that Honoria read 3 times. Mr. Price had been retained by a third party. He did not name the party, to locate her. There was, he wrote, a matter of some legal complexity relating to a particular clause in the original entailment of the Aldenmere estate. He believed she would find it worth her attention. He asked if she would be willing to travel to Edinburgh. Honoria set the letter down on her knee. She looked at the brick wall outside her window for a long time. Her grandfather had built Aldenmere. She had learned to walk in its east garden. She had sat in the library with him every Sunday afternoon while he read aloud from history books and drank tea that was always too hot. She had promised him, at the age of 12, that she would love that house forever. She had kept the promise. She had just done it from a distance. She folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket, and went back to finish the floor. She wrote to Mr. Price that same evening. She was in Edinburgh by Friday. The solicitor's office was on a narrow street just off the Royal Mile, the kind of office that had been in the same building for 100 years and intended to stay for another 100. Mr. Price himself was a small man in his 60s, with a very precise white beard and the habit of pausing before every sentence, as though considering whether it was strictly necessary. He was, to Honoria's quiet relief, not surprised by the state of her coat or her hands. He told her what he knew. Her grandfather, the 3rd Duke of Aldenmere, had included in the original entailment of the estate a clause that predated her uncle's inheritance. The clause was obscure. Her uncle's legal team had apparently not noticed it, or had chosen not to notice it. but it stipulated that if the estate were ever sold to satisfy debt, and if a direct female heir of the original line were living and unmarried, that heir retained a claim of right of residence for a period of not less than 1 year. Honoria stared at him. "A right of residence," she said. "Yes. In Aldenmere, yes. While the new owner is living there." Mr. Price paused. "That is correct. Does the new owner know about this clause?" Another pause. "He does now." She took the night coach back to Halifax, packed her 2 bags, and gave notice to Mrs. Tate. The woman was not pleased. Honoria left her an extra week's work folded into the pages of a receipt on the kitchen table. She did not write to Aldenmere ahead of her arrival. She reasoned that if she wrote, they would find a way to discourage her. She would arrive instead, invoke the clause, and deal with whatever happened next when it happened. She arrived at Aldenmere on a Thursday morning in late September. The road through the Highland approach had not changed. The hills were still that particular shade of purple-gray she had spent 4 years trying to remember correctly and never quite managing. The stone walls ran along the pasture edges exactly as they always had. The loch came into view around the final bend, and beyond it, rising from the hillside like something that had grown there rather than been built, was the house. It was, as it had always been, enormous. 3 stories of dark stone, the east wing added by her great-grandfather, the west wing rebuilt after a fire 50 years before that. The gardens were more overgrown than she remembered. Her grandfather's roses had not been maintained. She felt something she did not have a good word for. Not quite grief, not quite forth. Something in between that sat heavily in her chest. She paid the coachman, picked up her bags, and walked to the door. The housekeeper who answered was not the one Honoria remembered. Mrs. Garrow had been with the family for 30 years, a small, warm woman from Perthshire who had kept a jar of boiled sweets on her desk. This housekeeper was younger, perhaps 40, with an expression that could have meant anything and chose not to. "Miss Vell," she said. Not a question. "Yes." The woman's expression remained exactly the same. "His Grace is expecting you." This surprised Honoria slightly. She had not written. She was shown to a sitting room off the main hall and left there. She did not sit. She walked the perimeter of the room instead, looking at what had changed and what hadn't. The wallpaper was new. The painting above the fireplace, a landscape of the loch, painted by her grandmother, was still there. She was still looking at it when the door opened. Rowan Alcott, the Duke of Westerfield, was taller than she had expected, and younger than Mr. Price's letter had implied. He was perhaps 30. Perhaps a little more. Dark coat, no cravat yet at this hour. His hair was the kind of brown that looked black indoors. His face was not unkind, but it was not particularly open either. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has already thought about for some time. "Miss Vell," he said, "Your Grace." He did not gesture toward a chair. She did not move toward one. "You didn't write ahead," he said. "No, I was informed of the clause 3 weeks ago. I was informed of it 10 days ago." A brief silence. His eyes moved to the painting above the mantelpiece, then back to her. "You grew up here," he said. "It was not quite a question. My grandfather built the east wing." "I know." He paused. "Mr. Price sent me a copy of the family history." Another pause, very short. Among other documents. Something moved through Honoria that she chose not to examine too closely. "I assume," she said, "that you would prefer I not stay." "What I prefer," Rowan Alcott said, "is clarity." He looked at her steadily. "The clause is legal. I am not interested in contesting it. If you wish to exercise your right of residence, you may." Honoria had prepared for an argument. She had not prepared for this. "Then I will," she said. He inclined his head. "Mrs. Strachan will show you to a room." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "Dinner is at 7. You're welcome to join or not as you prefer." "I'll join," Honoria said. He left. Honoria turned back to her grandmother's painting and stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up her bags and went to find Mrs. Strachan. Her room was in the south corridor, second floor. It was not the room she had slept in as a child. That was in the east wing, and the east wing, Mrs. Strachan informed her without quite meeting her eye, was not currently in use. The room she was given was large and clean. The fire had been laid but not lit. The window looked out over the loch. When Mrs. Strachan left, Honoria sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was better than anything she had slept on in 4 years. She pressed her palms flat against the coverlet and made herself breathe slowly. She was back. She was in this house. She had 14 months, according to Mr. Price's reading of the clause, 1 year from the date she formally invoked it, and she intended to use every one of them. What she intended to do with that time was something she had not been entirely honest with herself about. There was a practical answer. She had asked Mr. Price whether her grandfather's clause contained any provision about her right to contest her uncle's management of the estate in the years before the sale. Mr. Price had told her very carefully that the answer might be yes, that certain documents, if they could be found, might suggest that Prentice Vell had concealed the extent of the debt from the other trustees for years, borrowing against Aldenmere in ways that were not, strictly speaking, legal. Those documents, if they existed, would be in this house, in the estate records, possibly in the library, where her grandfather had kept everything of importance. This was what she told herself she was here for. She did not ask herself, yet, about the other reason. The one that had more to do with her grandmother's painting still hanging in the sitting room, and the roses that had not been pruned, and the peculiar feeling of standing in the main hall again and knowing exactly which of the floorboards creaked. Dinner was in the dining room, which had been refurnished. The table was the same. That table was 12 feet long and made of Scottish oak and would outlast everyone in the house. But the chairs were different, simpler than the ones her grandfather had chosen, and better for it. The Duke sat at one end, Honoria sat at the other. Between them were 11 empty chairs. She looked at them for a moment. "Has the house had many guests?" she asked. Rowan Alcott looked up from his wine. "No. You eat here alone, then, usually." Honoria set down her fork. "That seems impractical for a table this size." The man considered this. Then, without elaborating, he said something to the footman stationed near the sideboard. A moment later, Honoria's place setting was moved down 6 chairs to the corner closest to where Rowan Alcott sat. He did not explain why he had agreed to the change. He did not seem like a man who explained things unless he believed explanation was necessary. They ate for a while in silence. Honoria noticed that he ate simply, without much interest in the food. She noticed that he asked the footman the name of the cook who had prepared the broth, and that, when the answer was given, he nodded as if filing it away. She noticed these things because she had spent 4 years learning to read the rooms she worked in, and the people who employed her, and the habit did not switch off simply because she was now the one seated at the long table. "How long have you been at Aldenmere?" she asked. "Since July. Do you find it suits you?" He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Not suspicion, exactly. More like careful attention. "It's large," he said. "It is and cold. The east wing is colder than the west," Honoria said. "The north-facing walls in the east wing lose heat twice as fast. My grandfather used to say he'd fix it. Every winter and every spring he'd forget again." Something shifted very slightly in Rowan Alcott's face. Not a smile. Something less than that and more interesting. "The east wing," he said, "is where the library is." "Yes. It's been closed since I arrived. I haven't had occasion to open it." "Why not?" A pause. "The housekeeper before Mrs. Strachan, the one your uncle kept, told the staff it was structurally unsound. I had a man look at it in August. He found nothing wrong with the structure." Honoria set down her wine glass. Then why has it stayed closed? I haven't decided what to do with it yet. It was such a plain answer that she didn't know what to do with it. She picked up her wine again. May I use it? She asked. He looked at her. Why? I'd like to read. Another pause, longer than the ones before. Yes, he said. After dinner, Honoria walked the house alone. She had not asked permission. No one had told her she needed it. She moved through the main corridor, up the secondary staircase, along the west passage. She opened doors and looked in and closed them again. The rooms smelled of stone and wood smoke and time. Most of them had not been lived in for years. The furniture was covered in sheets. She found the east wing door at the end of the upper corridor. It was not locked. She went in. The library was exactly as she remembered. The shelves reached the ceiling. The reading table in the center still had the ink stain on its left corner from when she had spilled a bottle at age 9 and tried to cover it with a book and failed. Her grandfather's collection was intact: history, law, natural philosophy, 3 shelves of French novels her grandmother had read and never returned to their proper places. She moved along the shelves. She was not tonight looking for the estate records. Tonight she was only looking. Her hand stopped on a small volume bound in dark red. She pulled it out. It was not a book. It was a journal. The name written on the inside cover was not her grandfather's. It was her grandmother's, Meredith Vell, 1889. Honoria had not known her grandmother kept a journal. She stood in the middle of the library, the unlit candle in one hand and the journal in the other, and felt the particular weight of something she had not expected to find. She put the journal back on the shelf. Not because she didn't want to read it. Because she thought she ought to ask, first, whether she should. She returned to her room and lay on the bed with her boots still on, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a great many things she could not yet put in order. The next morning she found the Duke in the garden. He was not gardening. He was standing at the edge of the old rose beds with a cup of tea, looking at them the way a person looks at a problem they are not yet sure how to approach. They haven't been cut back in 3 years, Honoria said. He turned. He had not heard her come up behind him, and she had the impression he was not a man who liked to be surprised. But he recovered quickly. So I was told. My grandfather bred 2 of these varieties himself. The pale pink ones, in the far bed. She looked at them. The plants were overgrown, heavy, some of the canes black with last year's growth. They're still alive. They'd come back if someone attended to them. Rowan Alcott looked at her. Do you know how? Yes. A pause. Then feel free, he said. It was not what she had expected him to say. She spent the morning in the rose beds. Mrs. Strachan sent out the gardener's tools without being asked, which Honoria took as a point in her favor. By noon, the first bed was clear. Her hands were scratched from the thorns, and she had dirt to the elbow, and she felt, for the first time in 4 years, as though she were somewhere she was supposed to be. She found the Duke at the top of the east wing stairs when she went inside to wash. He was standing with a set of ledgers under one arm, reading something in a file he held in the other hand. He had, apparently, decided to go into the library. He looked at her hands when she passed. The beds on the south wall are worse, she said. I believe it, he said. She kept walking. She heard him go into the library behind her. That evening she asked him about the journal. They were in the sitting room after dinner. Not by prior arrangement, but they had both arrived there independently, and neither had left. The fire was going. Outside, the autumn rain had started. In the library, she said, there is a journal belonging to my grandmother. I found it last night. I would like to read it, if you're willing. Rowan Alcott looked up from the ledger he was reviewing. It's your grandmother's journal. It's on your shelf, in your library. He looked at her for a moment. Is that why you asked to use the library? No, she said. I found it after. What were you looking for? She considered how to answer this. History, she said, which was true and incomplete, and he seemed to know it. "Read the journal," he said, "and whatever else you need." She did not tell him then about the estate records, about Mr. Price, about the possibility that her uncle had borrowed against Aldenmere in ways that were not legal, and that documents proving it might be in the very library they were both now using. She thought about telling him. She decided to find the documents first, and then decide. Her grandmother's journal took her 3 days to read. Meredith Vell had written in it every few days across the span of a single year, 1889. She had been 61 that year. Honoria's grandfather had been ill, though not yet dying. The journal was not what Honoria had expected, not a record of daily household matters, not a catalogue of weather and visitors. It was a record of thought. Her grandmother had been a precise and unsentimental woman who had seen a great deal and drawn her own conclusions about most of it. Honoria read it slowly. In the library, in the mornings, before the Duke arrived, she found what she was not looking for on the 4th day. Her grandmother had written in June of 1889 about a visit from Honoria's uncle. Prentice had been at that time 40 years old and already spending money he did not have. He had come to Aldenmere that June with a proposal. He wanted her grandfather to transfer a portion of the Aldenmere holdings, not the land, but the mineral rights to the eastern pastures, to a private company he was establishing. Her grandfather had refused, but the entry that followed 2 weeks later described something her grandmother had overheard. A conversation between Prentice and the family solicitor, not Mr. Price, but the solicitor who had worked for them at the time, a man named Aldwick. Her grandmother had written the substance of it in her careful, compressed handwriting. Prentice had asked Aldwick whether a document could be prepared that would transfer the mineral rights, without requiring the Duke's signature, whether there was a form of proxy arrangement that could be made to look legitimate. Aldwick had told him there was not, but her grandmother had noted at the bottom of the entry, "I believe he will find another lawyer. I believe he will find a way. I am writing this down because I am old, and the world does not always remember what it should." Honoria closed the journal. She sat at the reading table for a long time. Outside the library window, the Highland autumn was turning the hillsides. The loch was flat and gray. A heron stood in the shallows, perfectly still. If her grandmother was right, if Prentice had found another lawyer and had found a way, then there would be a record of it, a document somewhere that was either forged or improperly executed. And if that document could be found, it might change the legal status of the sale that had followed. It might mean that Aldenmere had been sold under false pretenses. It might mean a great many things that Honoria did not yet know how to think clearly about. She put the journal back on its shelf. She found the estate record boxes on the lower shelves of the north wall, where they had always been kept. There were 11 of them. She started with the earliest. She was still there when the Duke came in. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the boxes she had spread across the reading table and the floor. "Miss Vell," he said. She looked up. She had been so deep in the ledgers that she had lost track of time. The light had shifted. It was late afternoon. "Your Grace," she said. He came into the room. He looked at the boxes. He looked at her. "What are you looking for?" he asked. His voice was even, not angry, something harder to read. She had decided that morning that if he found her, she would tell him the truth. It had seemed straightforward in the morning. It was considerably less straightforward now, with him standing 6 feet away, looking at her with those careful, measuring eyes. She told him anyway. She told him about Mr. Price, about the clause and what it might mean, about her grandmother's journal and what she had read in it, about her uncle and the mineral rights and the lawyer named Aldwick, and the possibility that the documents underlying the sale of Aldenmere were not legitimate. She told him all of it, cleanly and without apology, while the afternoon light moved across the library floor. When she finished, he sat down. Not at the reading table. In the old armchair beside the window, the one that had been her grandfather's. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. He said nothing for a long time. "If you find what you're looking for," he said at last, "what do you intend to do with it?" Honoria had thought about this. "I don't know," she said, which was honest, which was the best she could offer. He looked up at her. "You might have told me this at the start." "I might have, but you didn't." "No." He looked at her for a long moment. "I bought this house," he said, "from a creditor's sale. I paid what was asked. I believe the title was clean." He paused. "If the title is not clean, I have been defrauded." Another pause, shorter. "By your uncle, not by you." Honoria said nothing. "Keep looking," he said. He stood. "If you find something, tell me." He left. She kept looking. She found what she was searching for on the 9th day. It was in the 7th box, in a folder of documents dated 1897, 8 years after her grandmother's journal entry. Her uncle had not moved quickly. He had waited until Honoria's grandfather was elderly, and her grandmother 2 years dead. He had found a solicitor in Glasgow, whose name Honoria did not recognize, and the documents he had produced were, on first examination, impeccable. But her grandmother had been right about one thing. There was a discrepancy. Small, nearly invisible, the kind of thing a busy solicitor processing a sale might not notice. The proxy arrangement her uncle had used required a witness signature. The witness listed was a man named Aldwick, the same man who, 8 years before, had refused to help Prentice at all. Either Aldwick had changed his mind, or someone had signed for him. Honoria sat very still. She took the document carefully from the folder. She carried it to the window and held it to the light. The signature was not the same. She had seen Aldwick's signature on several legitimate documents already. The letter forms were different. The pressure of the pen was different. She went to find the Duke. He was in the estate office on the ground floor, and when she came in with the folder, he looked up and read her face before she said anything. She showed him the documents. She explained the discrepancy. She set the 2 signatures side by side on the desk and showed him the difference. He looked at them for a long time. "I'll need a solicitor to confirm it," he said. "Yes." "And a handwriting expert, yes." He leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a moment. "Then this will take time. Legal proceedings, if it comes to that, could take months, years." "I know. And at the end of it," he said, "the outcome is uncertain. Courts have found against cleaner cases than this." Honoria looked at him. "I know that too." He studied her face. "Why are you doing this? Your residence here is already guaranteed for the year. You could simply stay. You don't have to take this further." She thought about her grandmother, sitting in the East Wing writing in her journal. About her grandfather in the library on Sunday afternoons with his tea that was always too hot. About promises made at the age of 12 to a house that had never stopped being hers in any way that mattered. "Because he was wrong," she said, "and because someone should say so." Rowan Alcott looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said. He pulled a sheet of paper toward him. "I'll write to Edinburgh tonight." November came. The Highland winter arrived without ceremony. One morning the world was autumn, and the next the hills were white and the loch was the color of iron, and the wind came off the north face of the mountain with something personal in it. Honoria had not expected to find the house comfortable. It was large and cold, and full of the particular quality of silence that old stone buildings keep, a silence that has texture and weight. But she found herself sleeping well. She found herself eating properly for the first time in years. She found, incrementally, that the rooms she moved through every day felt less like a contested space and more like something she was slowly being allowed back into. The Duke was a difficult man to know. He spoke in short sentences and did not elaborate unless pressed. He spent long hours in the estate office, reviewing the accounts that Prentice had left in disorder, and he asked Honoria, one evening in the library, whether she knew anything about estate management. She did. Her grandfather had taught her when she was 15, on the grounds that she ought to know how things worked. She began going through the accounts with him in the evenings. It was not a romantic arrangement. It was a practical one. They sat on opposite sides of the desk and worked through the figures methodically, and she explained which holdings had historically been profitable and which had been let run down, and he listened with that focused, precise attention that she was beginning to recognize as one of his particular qualities. One night she mentioned, without thinking about it much, that the mill on the North Road had been her grandfather's favorite investment, that he had spent 3 summers improving it, that he had known the miller's family by name. Rowan Alcott set down his pen. "Why did your uncle let it fall because he didn't care about it?" Honoria said. "He cared about the income. He never cared about the thing generating the income." A silence. "Your grandfather sounds like a particular kind of man," the Duke said. He was. He looked at her, not the measuring look which she had grown used to, something slightly different. "You miss him." "Every day." He said nothing. He picked up his pen again, but something had shifted in the air of the room very slightly, and they both knew it had. December brought the legal correspondence. Mr. Price wrote twice, and then a second solicitor appeared, one who specialized in title disputes. And then the matter of the Glasgow lawyer and the fraudulent signature became something with structure to it, something that could be argued and documented and eventually, perhaps, decided. It would take time. Everyone agreed on this. One afternoon, a week before Christmas, Honoria found a letter on the table in the hall. It was from her uncle Prentice. She recognized his handwriting, and felt, as she always did when she saw it, a particular kind of tiredness. She took it to the sitting room and opened it. It was short. Prentice had heard, through some channel she did not know and did not need to, about the legal challenge. He wrote that he hoped she would reconsider. He wrote that the matter was old and settled and ought to stay that way. He wrote, at the end, that she had always been a difficult girl and that she would find this harder than she expected. Honoria folded the letter. She sat with it in her lap for a while. The fire crackled. Outside the snow was coming down, and through the window she could see the south rose beds, the ones she had cleared, and the pale-tipped canes of her grandfather's varieties, still alive despite everything. She thought about the word difficult. She thought about what it meant, said by a man like her uncle, about a woman like her. She thought about all the ways she had been told, in the past 4 years, that what she was doing was impractical, or unwise, or more trouble than it was worth. She put the letter in the fire. The Duke found her there an hour later. He had snow on his coat from inspecting something in the outbuildings. He stopped in the doorway, took in her expression, and came to sit in the chair across from her without asking what was wrong. She told him about the letter. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the fire. "He'll try something else," he said. "Yes, it won't change the documents." "No." He looked at her. "He called you difficult. He's been calling me that since I was 9. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. She was beginning to catalog these small movements, the ones that were the closest he came to showing what he thought. "What did you do when you were 9 to earn it?" She considered. "I told him his horse was badly shod and he was going to lame it if he didn't have the farrier out. He told me girls didn't know anything about horses. I wrote to the farrier myself. Was the horse lame? It would have been." This time it was a smile. Small, contained, but genuine. She felt it like something settling into place. "Then he's been wrong about you," Rowan Alcott said, "since you were 9. She looked at him across the fire. He was looking back at her in a way he had not looked at her before, without the measuring quality, without the careful distance. Just looking. The rose canes you cut back, he said after a moment. If the winter they're back in spring. If the winter isn't too hard, will you be here to see them? She held his gaze. That depends on a great many things, on the legal outcome, among other things. He looked at her steadily. She had the impression that he was, in his careful and unhurried way, arriving somewhere, that had been moving towards something for weeks, in the same methodical fashion he brought to everything, the accounts, the estate, the long evenings in the library, and that he was nearly there. I would like you to stay, he said, not as a performance, not as obligation. The way a man says a thing he has thought about for a long time and decided is simply true. Honoria did not answer immediately. She thought about what that would mean. She thought about the accounts spread across the estate office desk and the rose beds, and the library with her grandmother's journal on the shelf, and her grandfather's chair by the window that the Duke had apparently claimed without knowing whose it had been. She thought about what it meant to belong to a place, whether belonging was something that could be shared. Ask me again, she said, in spring. He looked at her. The firelight was on his face. All right, he said. Christmas at Aldenmere was quiet. There had been no Christmas at Aldenmere for 4 years, or there had been, but it had been her uncle's Christmas, and she had spent those in Halifax or wherever else she happened to be, and she had done her best not to think about it. This one was different. Mrs. Strachan, who had thawed by degrees over the preceding months into something that resembled warmth, organized the household with quiet efficiency. There was a tree in the main hall. The cook, whose name was, Honoria had discovered, Mr. Guthrie, produced a meal from the traditional receipts that had always been used at Aldenmere, which he had apparently found in a box in the kitchen storeroom and cross-referenced with Mrs. Strachan's memory. The Duke ate with the household that evening. Not by tradition. By choice. Honoria found herself at some point late in the evening standing in the library doorway watching the snow fall over the lock. The house was warm behind her. She could hear voices from the hall. Rowan Alcott came and stood beside her. They stood in silence for a while looking at the snow. My grandfather used to say, Honoria said, that this house was built to outlast everything. The weather, the politics, the family arguments, everything. She paused. I used to think he meant it as a comfort, and now I think. He meant it as a challenge. The Duke said nothing for a moment. Then, to be worth the house, yes. He was quiet beside her. The snow came down in the particular soft and unhurried way it came down here without urgency. You are, he said. She did not look at him. She was not ready quite yet to look at him when he said things like that, but she felt it, the weight of it, the seriousness of it, the way he said things exactly as he meant them, no more and no less. Thank you, she said. They stood there until the cold drove them back inside. January brought the confirmation from the handwriting expert in Edinburgh. The signature on the proxy document was not, in his professional opinion, the signature of the man whose name appeared beneath it. He had reviewed 3 authenticated examples and found 17 points of discrepancy. Mr. Price wrote to say that the matter was now strong enough to proceed to a formal challenge. Honoria read the letter twice. She folded it carefully. She went to the estate office. The Duke was at his desk. He looked up when she came in and read her face as he always did now, quickly and accurately. She held out the letter. He read it. He set it on the desk. He looked at her. It doesn't resolve everything, he said. The court will still need to make a ruling. I know, and a ruling in your favor would complicate the ownership. Yes. He looked at her steadily. I am not, in that scenario, your adversary. She knew this. She had known it for some time. I know. Whatever the court decides, he said, I would like to propose something. He paused. One of his considered pauses, the kind that meant he was about to say something he had thought about carefully. That, whatever the legal outcome, Aldenmere remains as it is, as we have managed it. Honoria looked at him. The house has been better managed in the past 3 months, he said plainly, than it was in the preceding 10 years. That's a fact. Not sentiment, no, she agreed. Not sentiment? And, he said, and this was quieter, more careful, I would rather you were here. She held his gaze. She thought about the long evenings with the accounts and the rose beds in the snow and the library with its 2 armchairs and the question he had asked her in December that she had not yet answered. In spring, she said, the pale pink roses will bloom first. My grandfather was very proud of them. He waited. I intend to be here when they do, she said. Something in Rowan Alcott's face, that carefully held, habitually reserved face, came open. Not much. Just enough. His eyes changed. He nodded once. It was enough. March arrived and the world turned without permission. The snow retreated up the hillsides. The loch changed color. And in the south rose beds, where Honoria had cut back the overgrown canes in September, the new growth came in pale and certain. The legal proceedings were ongoing. They would be ongoing for some time. The outcome was not guaranteed. None of it was simple, and none of it would be. But on the morning when the first of her grandfather's roses opened, that particular pale pink that had not bloomed in 4 years, the variety her grandfather had bred himself, that had survived 3 winters of neglect and still remembered what it was supposed to do. Honoria was in the garden, and Rowan Alcott came and stood beside her. Without being asked, without ceremony, the way a man stands beside someone when he intends to keep standing there. She did not answer the question he had asked her in December, not with words. She simply stayed where she was. That, she thought, was answer enough. Some things are taken from you by people who never understood their value. Some houses outlast the people who misuse them, and some choices, made quietly and without fanfare, in gardens in the early morning while the Highland air is still cold and the world is still finding its footing, are the only choices that matter. Honoria Vell had come home. She had found it changed and unchanged and difficult and worth it. She stayed.